Thomas Barrett was 42 years old when he made the purchase that would change everything. He stood in front of the dilapidated wool shed on the outskirts of a small rural town in western Montana, squinting against the afternoon sun as the realtor fumbled with the rusted padlock. The building had been abandoned for nearly 18 years, ever since the previous owner, an elderly sheep farmer named Walter Gibson, had passed away without heirs. The corrugated iron roof was peppered with holes, the wooden frame sagged dangerously to one side, and wild grass grew knee-high around the foundation. Most people who passed by didn't even glance at the eyesore anymore. It was just another relic of a dying industry, a reminder of better times long gone. But Thomas saw something different. He saw potential. He saw a future. And most importantly, he saw a way to honor the craft that had been passed down through 4 generations of his family before him. Thomas had been a sheep shearer since he was 19 years old, learning the trade from his father, Robert Barrett, who had learned it from his father before him. It was grueling, physical work that paid poorly and offered no benefits, no retirement plan, and no respect from a world that increasingly valued technology over tradition. By the time Thomas reached his early 40s, his back ached every morning, his hands were permanently calloused, and he could barely afford the mortgage on his modest trailer home. He had never married, never had children, and spent most of his time on the road traveling from ranch to ranch with his shearing equipment loaded in the back of a battered pickup truck. His life was simple, solitary, and according to most people who knew him, going nowhere. His younger brother, Michael, had begged him for years to give up shearing and take a steady job at the hardware store in town. But Thomas couldn't do it. Shearing wasn't just what he did for a living, it was who he was. The wool shed came up for auction on a grey Tuesday morning in late September. Thomas had heard about it from Dorothy Hoffman, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher who still kept a small flock of 35 sheep on her property and hired Thomas every spring for shearing. She mentioned it casually over coffee after he finished her flock, saying the county was finally selling off Walter Gibson's old place and wondering aloud if anyone would ever bother buying it. Thomas felt something stir inside him when she said it, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore either. That evening, he drove out to see the property for himself. The shed sat on 4 acres of overgrown land at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by hills covered in sagebrush and juniper trees. It was isolated, neglected, and utterly perfect. As he walked through the knee-high grass circling the building, Thomas could almost hear the echoes of sheep bleating, shears buzzing, and men calling out to each other during the busy season. This place had history. It had soul, and it was asking for someone to bring it back to life. The auction was sparsely attended. Only 7 people showed up, most of them developers looking to buy the land cheap and flip it for a profit. Thomas sat in the back row of the county courthouse with his checkbook tucked inside his jacket pocket, feeling his heart pound as the auctioneer began the bidding. The opening price was set at $18,000, far more than Thomas had in his savings account. He had managed to scrape together $11,000 by selling his truck, borrowing $3,000 from his brother Michael, and emptying every dollar from the emergency fund he'd been building for the past decade. When the bidding began, a man in an expensive suit immediately offered $19,000. Another developer countered with $21,000. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He couldn't compete with these people. They had money, resources, connections. All he had was a dream and a checkbook that was about to bounce. But then something unexpected happened. The bidding stalled. The developers began whispering among themselves, checking their phones, recalculating numbers. One by one, they dropped out. The man in the expensive suit shook his head and walked out of the courthouse entirely. Within 15 minutes, the only remaining bidder was Thomas Barrett and a woman in her 50s who owned a small real estate company. She raised her paddle and offered $22,000. The auctioneer called for higher bids. Thomas took a deep breath, raised his paddle, and said in a voice that barely carried across the room, $23,000. The woman turned to look at him, sizing him up with sharp eyes. She raised her paddle again. 24,000. Thomas felt sweat bead on his forehead. He was already over his budget by more than $10,000. If he went higher, he would be in debt for years, but if he didn't, he would lose the one thing that felt like it was meant to be his. 25,000, he said, his voice steadier this time. The woman hesitated. She glanced at her phone, then back at Thomas. After what felt like an eternity, she lowered her paddle and shook her head. The auctioneer called out, "Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back for $25,000. Thomas Barrett had just bought a collapsing wool shed on 4 acres of land he couldn't afford, with money he didn't have, for a business that everyone said was already dead. When Thomas told his brother Michael about the purchase that evening, Michael stared at him in stunned silence for a full 30 seconds before exploding. "Are you out of your mind? You sold your truck. You borrowed money from me, and for what? A pile of rotting wood and rusted metal that's going to cost another $50,000 just to make livable." Thomas tried to explain, but Michael wasn't having it. "You're 42 years old, Tom. When are you going to grow up and face reality? Shearing is over. The industry is dying. Nobody cares about wool anymore. You should have taken that job at the hardware store when they offered it." Thomas listened quietly, then said something that surprised even himself. "I'm not buying a building, Mike. I'm buying a second chance. For me, for this town, and for everyone who still believes that some things are worth saving." Michael shook his head and walked away, muttering about stubbornness and foolishness. But Thomas didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first time Thomas unlocked the shed and stepped inside, he immediately regretted everything. The smell hit him first, a combination of mildew, rotting wood, and decades of accumulated dust. Sunlight streamed through dozens of holes in the roof, illuminating swirling clouds of particles that made him cough violently. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, with weeds pushing through the gaps. Old shearing equipment lay scattered and rusted in corners, remnants of a time when this place had been alive with activity. Birds had nested in the rafters, and their droppings covered nearly every surface. One entire wall had partially collapsed, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the interior to the elements. Thomas walked slowly through the space, his boots crunching on broken glass and debris, and for the first time since the auction, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd done. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. This was a disaster, and he had no idea how he was going to turn it into anything resembling functional. That night, Thomas sat in his trailer with a notebook and pen, trying to create some kind of plan. He needed materials, tools, labor, and most importantly, money. He calculated that basic repairs would cost at least $32,000, not including the equipment he would need to actually run a proper shearing operation. He had exactly $843 left in his bank account. The math wasn't adding up, no matter how many times he recalculated. He considered calling his brother and asking for more help, but after their last conversation, he knew that was pointless. He thought about applying for a loan, but his credit score was terrible, and no bank would take a chance on a failing business in a dying industry. For hours, Thomas sat there in the dim light of his trailer, staring at the numbers that refused to make sense, and wondering if Michael had been right all along. Maybe he was just a stubborn fool chasing a dream that had already died. The next morning, Thomas drove back to the shed with his toolbox and a determination that surprised even himself. If he couldn't afford to hire contractors, he would do the work himself. He started with the simplest tasks, clearing out the debris, sweeping away years of accumulated dirt, and removing the birds' nests from the rafters. It was slow, back-breaking work that left him exhausted and covered in grime by the end of each day. But with every load of trash he hauled away, the space began to breathe again. Within a week, he had cleared the entire interior and could finally see the bones of what the building used to be. The frame was still solid in most places, constructed from thick timber beams that had weathered nearly 7 decades. The foundation, though cracked, was structurally sound. The shearing platform, though worn, could be restored. Thomas began to see not what the shed was, but what it could become again. Word spread slowly through the small community that Thomas Barrett had bought Walter Gibson's old wool shed. Most people thought he was crazy, but a few saw something worth supporting. Dorothy Hoffman, the retired schoolteacher who had first told him about the property, showed up one Saturday morning with homemade sandwiches and lemonade. "I figured you might need some fuel," she said with a warm smile. She stayed for 3 hours, helping him sort through old equipment and sharing stories about Walter Gibson and the glory days when the shed processed wool from over 3,000 sheep every season. Her presence reminded Thomas why he was doing this. It wasn't just about saving a building, it was about preserving a way of life that connected generations. A few days later, James Cooper, a 55-year-old carpenter who had done some work on Thomas's trailer years earlier, stopped by unexpectedly. He walked around the property with a critical eye, examining the damaged roof, the collapsed wall, and the sagging frame. Thomas braced himself for another lecture about foolishness and wasted effort. Instead, James said, "You're going to need help with that roof. I can spare a few hours on weekends if you're interested." Thomas was stunned. "I can't pay you much," he admitted. James waved him off. "My grandfather worked in this shed back in the 50s. I'd like to see it standing again. We can figure out payment later." That weekend, James showed up with his tools and his 28-year-old son Nathan, and together they began reinforcing the frame and patching the roof. The work was technical and demanding, but James was patient, teaching Thomas carpentry skills he'd never learned and treating him like an equal rather than a charity case. As the weeks passed, more people began to appear. Margaret Ellis, a 63-year-old woman who ran a small fabric shop in town, donated several rolls of industrial tarp to cover the roof temporarily until proper repairs could be completed. Frank Patterson, a retired sheep rancher in his early 70s, brought over his old shearing equipment that had been sitting unused in his barn for over a decade, saying Thomas might as well have it, since Frank had no one to pass it on to. Even Michael, Thomas's skeptical brother, showed up one afternoon with a truckload of lumber he'd gotten at a discount through his connections at the hardware store. He didn't say much, just helped unload the wood and stayed to work alongside his brother for the rest of the day. Thomas felt something shift inside him as he watched these people give their time, resources and energy to support his seemingly impossible dream. He realized he wasn't alone in this. The community, though small and struggling itself, still believed in second chances and preserving what mattered. By the end of the second month, the shed had been transformed from a collapsing ruin into something that almost resembled a functional building. The roof was repaired, the collapsed wall had been rebuilt, and the interior was clean and organized. Thomas had spent every spare moment working on the space, often staying until well after dark, with only a battery-powered lantern for light. His body ached constantly, his hands were raw and blistered, and he'd lost 14 pounds from the physical demands of the work. But when he stood in the center of the shed and looked around at what he'd accomplished, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt pride. He felt purpose. And he felt like maybe, just maybe, this crazy plan might actually work. If you've made it this far in Thomas's journey, I'd love for you to join our community by hitting that subscribe button. This story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever taken a leap of faith on something everyone else thought was impossible? I'd love to hear your story. Now let's continue with what Thomas discovered next. With the physical structure of the shed finally stable, Thomas faced a new challenge that he hadn't fully anticipated. He needed sheep, lots of them. The whole point of restoring the wool shed was to create a centralized shearing operation that could serve multiple ranchers in the region. But first, he had to convince those ranchers that his operation was worth their business. Most of the established sheep farmers in the area had their own arrangements with traveling shearers or took their flocks to larger operations 3 counties over. Thomas was an unknown commodity with an untested facility, and in the conservative world of sheep ranching, reputation was everything. He spent 2 weeks driving from ranch to ranch, knocking on doors and making his pitch. Some ranchers were polite but dismissive. Others didn't even invite him past the front gate. A few listened with genuine interest, but wanted to wait and see if the operation actually succeeded before committing their flocks. Thomas understood their hesitation, but it didn't make the rejection any easier to swallow. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Catherine Reynolds was a 39-year-old single mother who had inherited her father's ranch 2 years earlier after his sudden death from a heart attack. She had 280 sheep, no experience in ranching, and a teenage son named Ethan, who had absolutely no interest in rural life and spent most of his time trying to convince his mother to sell the property and move to Seattle. Catherine had been struggling to keep the operation running, learning everything as she went and making costly mistakes along the way. When Thomas showed up at her ranch on a Thursday afternoon, she was in the middle of trying to fix a broken water pump with a YouTube video playing on her phone. She looked exhausted, frustrated, and ready to give up. Thomas offered to help with the pump, and within 20 minutes he had it running again. Catherine invited him in for coffee, and he made his pitch about the wool shed. Unlike the other ranchers, Catherine didn't have established relationships or years of experience to fall back on. She was desperate for reliable help and willing to take a chance on someone who seemed genuine and knowledgeable. "When's the next shearing?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "I've been trying to figure out who to hire for weeks, and everyone I call is either booked solid or charges more than I can afford." Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. This was the moment he'd been hoping for. "I'm planning to open for business in 3 weeks. I can do your whole flock for 40% less than the going rate, and the quality will be better because I'll have proper equipment and facilities instead of working out of the back of a truck." Catherine studied him carefully. "Why so cheap? Are you any good?" Thomas smiled. "I'm very good. Been doing this for 23 years, and I'm charging less because I need to build a client base. Once I prove myself, prices will go up to market rate, but early adopters get a discount. That's just good business." Catherine thought about it for a moment, then extended her hand. "You've got a deal, Thomas Barrett. But if you do a good job, I'm telling every rancher I know about your operation." Catherine Reynolds turned out to be Thomas's biggest advocate. After he sheared her flock with a speed and precision that impressed even her skeptical teenage son, she kept her promise and spread the word throughout the ranching community. She posted photos of her sheep on social media, talked up the quality of Thomas's work at the local feed store, and personally called 3 other ranchers to recommend his services. Within 2 weeks, Thomas had bookings from 5 more operations, including a larger ranch with over 600 sheep. The momentum was building, and for the first time since buying the property, Thomas felt like he might actually be able to make this work financially. But just as things were starting to look up, he discovered something in the shed that would change everything in ways he never could have imagined. It happened on a Saturday morning while Thomas was organizing the storage area in the back of the shed. He was moving old wooden crates that had been stacked against the wall for decades when one of them broke apart in his hands, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the debris were dozens of old photographs, yellowed with age and curling at the edges. Thomas picked one up and found himself looking at a black and white image of the wool shed in its prime, circa 1956, according to the date stamped on the back. The building was surrounded by workers, sheep pens overflowing with animals, and trucks lined up waiting to load wool bales. But it was the next photograph that stopped Thomas cold. It showed a young man, maybe 24 or 25 years old, standing proudly in front of the shed with shears in hand and a wide smile on his face. Thomas flipped the photo over and read the inscription written in faded ink. "Robert Barrett, first day at Gibson Wool Shed, May 1957. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. Robert Barrett was his father's name. His father had worked in this very shed nearly 70 years ago, before Thomas was even born, before his father had moved east and started his own shearing business. His father had never mentioned it. Not once in all the years they worked together, in all the stories he told about learning the trade, had he ever said a word about working at the Gibson shed. Thomas sat down on the dusty floor, surrounded by photographs, and began going through them one by one. There were dozens of images of his father, some alone, some with other workers, all of them showing a young man who looked so much like Thomas that it was almost eerie. In one photo, Robert Barrett stood next to an elderly man who Thomas assumed must be Walter Gibson, the original owner. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like old friends. There were photos of shearing competitions, community gatherings, and celebrations that had taken place in and around the shed. Each image told a story of a vibrant, thriving community built around this building and the work that happened inside it. Thomas realized with growing emotion that he hadn't just stumbled upon this property by accident. He had been led here by something deeper than chance. This place was part of his family's history, part of his own story in ways he was only beginning to understand. The shed wasn't just a building he was trying to save. It was a connection to his father, to his past, and to a legacy that had been waiting for him to rediscover it. Thomas spent that entire weekend going through every box, crate, and corner of the storage area, uncovering more pieces of his father's history at the Gibson shed. He found employment records showing that Robert Barrett had worked there for 3 years, from 1957 to 1960, before leaving to pursue opportunities elsewhere. He found competition certificates showing that his father had won multiple shearing contests during his time at the shed, establishing himself as one of the fastest and most skilled shearers in the region. He found letters, newspaper clippings, and even a small journal that his father had kept during those years. As Thomas read through the journal entries, he began to understand why his father had never spoken about this place. The entries started optimistic and excited, full of dreams about building a future in the shearing industry. But gradually they became darker, documenting struggles with money, conflicts with other workers, and eventually a bitter falling out with Walter Gibson over wages and working conditions. The final entry, dated November 1960, was short and angry. "Leaving this place tomorrow. Gibson refused to pay what I'm worth. He'll regret losing his best shearer. I'm done with this shed forever." Thomas sat back processing this information. His father had left here hurt and angry, carrying resentment that apparently lasted the rest of his life. That's why he never mentioned it. That's why he never came back, even when he was working ranches just miles away in later years. The old wounds had never healed. But as Thomas looked around the restored shed, at all the work he'd poured into bringing it back to life, he realized something profound. He wasn't his father. He didn't have to carry those old resentments. He could honor his father's talent and dedication to the craft while letting go of the bitterness that had kept Robert Barrett away from this place. In fact, Thomas could do something his father never got the chance to do. He could prove that the Gibson shed could be a place of fair treatment, good wages, and community support. He could transform the legacy from one of conflict to one of redemption. The thought filled him with new purpose and determination. This wasn't just about running a shearing operation anymore. It was about healing old wounds and creating something his father would have been proud of, even if he never got to see it. Thomas decided to create a memorial to his father and all the other workers who had labored in the shed over the decades. He cleared a wall near the entrance and began mounting the old photographs in frames he built from reclaimed wood. He created a timeline showing the shed's history, starting from its construction in 1951 through its glory years and eventual abandonment. He included his father's competition certificates and a copy of one of the newspaper articles that had praised Robert Barrett's skill. At the center of the display, he mounted the photograph of his father standing with Walter Gibson, but he added his own handwritten note beneath it. Robert Barrett, 1957-1960, master shearer, dedicated craftsman, and my father. This shed stands again because of the skills you taught me and the passion for this work that you passed down. Your legacy continues. When Dorothy Hoffman saw the memorial during her next visit, she wiped tears from her eyes. Your father would be so proud of you, Thomas. You've taken something broken and made it beautiful again. James Cooper, the carpenter who had helped with the repairs, stood silently in front of the photographs for several minutes before speaking. My grandfather is in some of these pictures. I never knew he worked here. This means more than you know. Word about the memorial spread through the community, and soon Thomas was receiving visits from elderly residents who had family members who had worked at the shed decades earlier. They brought their own photographs, their own stories, their own memories of a time when the wool shed had been the heart of the local economy. Thomas added each contribution to the growing display, turning the memorial into a living history of the community itself. What had started as a personal tribute to his father became something much larger, a celebration of everyone who had contributed to the sheep and wool industry in the region. The memorial attracted attention beyond just the local community. A reporter from the regional newspaper came to do a story about the restoration of the historic wool shed and the surprising family connection Thomas had discovered. The article was picked up by a larger state newspaper, then by a national agricultural magazine. Suddenly, Thomas Barrett and his wool shed were getting attention he never expected and never sought. The publicity brought both opportunities and challenges. More ranchers began booking shearing appointments, some driving from over 100 miles away just to see the restored facility and be part of its renewed story. But the attention also brought scrutiny. A blogger who focused on agricultural history visited the shed and wrote a detailed article questioning whether Thomas was properly preserving the historical integrity of the building or simply exploiting its history for commercial gain. An advocacy group for historical preservation sent representatives to evaluate the shed and determine whether it should be designated as a protected historical site, which would come with both recognition and restrictions on how Thomas could use the property. Environmental regulators showed up to inspect his water usage and waste disposal systems. Insurance inspectors arrived to assess risk factors. The simple dream of running a shearing operation was becoming complicated by bureaucracy, public scrutiny, and expectations Thomas had never anticipated. But through it all, Thomas kept his focus on what mattered most, doing excellent work, treating his clients fairly, and honoring the craft that connected him to his father and to generations of shearers who had worked in this very building. By his first full season in operation, Thomas was shearing over 2,800 sheep from 17 different ranches. He had hired 2 part-time workers to help with the larger operations, including Nathan Cooper, the carpenter's son, who showed natural talent for the work. The shed was running efficiently, the equipment was performing well, and Thomas was finally starting to see some financial return on his massive investment. He still owed money to his brother, to various suppliers, and to the bank that had reluctantly given him a small business loan. But he was making steady payments, and more importantly, he was building something sustainable. The shed wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to thrive again. The transformation that had taken place went far beyond just the physical structure of the wool shed or the success of Thomas's business. Something deeper had shifted in the community itself. The shed had become a gathering place, a point of connection for people who had felt increasingly isolated in a region that had been economically struggling for years. On shearing days, it wasn't uncommon to find elderly residents stopping by to watch the work and share memories of the old days. Young people from local schools began requesting tours to learn about agricultural history and traditional crafts. Catherine Reynolds, the single mother who had been Thomas's first client, brought her son Ethan to help with sheep handling during busy periods, and the teenager discovered that he actually enjoyed the physical work and the sense of accomplishment it provided. By the end of that first summer, Ethan had changed his mind about leaving Montana and was seriously considering studying agricultural business in college so he could help his mother run the ranch more effectively. Catherine credited Thomas and the shed for giving her son a new perspective on rural life and showing him that traditions could be honored while still adapting to modern challenges. Dorothy Hoffman, the retired school teacher who had first told Thomas about the property, organized a community celebration to mark the one-year anniversary of the shed's reopening. Over 200 people attended, including ranchers, townspeople and visitors from neighboring counties. There was barbecue, live music from a local country band, and a shearing demonstration that drew cheers and applause from the crowd. Thomas stood at the edge of the gathering, watching people laugh and talk and celebrate together, and felt overwhelmed by what had been accomplished. Just 15 months earlier, he had been a struggling shearer living in a trailer, with no prospects and no hope for anything better. Now he owned a thriving business, had earned the respect of his community, and had discovered a family history that connected him to this place in profound ways. His brother Michael approached him during the celebration, carrying 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to Thomas and clinked them together. "I was wrong, Tom. I'm sorry I doubted you. What you've done here, it's something special." Thomas smiled and put his arm around his brother's shoulders. "You helped me do it, Mike. That lumber you brought, those weekends you spent working here, that mattered. I couldn't have done this alone." But the real miracle that the press had been hinting at in their articles wasn't just about the restoration of an old building or the success of a small business. It was about what happened when people refused to give up on things that mattered, when they invested their time and energy into preserving traditions while adapting them for new generations. The woolshed had become a symbol of resilience, community, and the belief that some things are worth fighting for even when everyone says they're impossible. Thomas received dozens of letters and emails from people across the country who had read about the shed and were inspired by the story. Several were from young people considering careers in agriculture who had been discouraged by family members or teachers telling them there was no future in farming or ranching. Thomas tried to respond to every message, encouraging them to pursue their passions and reminding them that success often comes from places we least expect. The historical preservation group that had initially seemed like a bureaucratic obstacle ended up designating the shed as a protected historical site, which came with grant funding for continued maintenance and preservation. The environmental inspection that Thomas had worried about resulted in commendations for his sustainable water usage and waste management systems, which became a case study for other agricultural operations in the region. The blogger who had questioned his motives returned to write a follow-up article praising the way Thomas had balanced commercial viability with historical integrity. Each challenge that had seemed overwhelming at the time had ultimately led to unexpected opportunities and recognition. As Thomas reflected on the journey during quiet moments in the shed, he understood that none of it had been about him personally. He had simply been willing to take the first step, to believe in something when belief seemed foolish, and to work hard without knowing if success was even possible. The real credit belonged to everyone who had helped along the way, to the community that had supported him, and to the generations of shearers who had established the traditions he was now carrying forward. 2 years after purchasing the property, Thomas received a phone call that brought everything full circle. A woman named Sarah Barrett, who identified herself as his father's cousin, had read about the woolshed in a magazine article. She explained that she had boxes of her father's belongings, including more photographs and documents from his time working with Robert Barrett at the Gibson shed in the 1950s. She wanted to donate them to Thomas's memorial collection. When Sarah arrived the following week, she brought not just photographs, but also a letter that Robert Barrett had written to her father in 1975, 15 years after leaving the shed. In the letter, Thomas's father expressed regret about how things had ended with Walter Gibson, acknowledged that his own pride had contributed to the conflict, and admitted that working at the Gibson shed had been some of the best years of his life. The letter revealed that Robert Barrett had carried his own regret and wished he had handled things differently. Thomas added the letter to the memorial, placing it next to his father's photograph. It felt like the final piece of the puzzle, the healing of a wound that had existed long before Thomas even knew about it. The wool shed continues to operate successfully, now in its third year under Thomas's management. He has expanded to serve 26 ranchers and has trained 5 apprentice shearers, who are learning the craft and ensuring that the skills will continue to the next generation. The memorial has grown to include contributions from over 40 families, creating one of the most comprehensive collections of rural agricultural history in the region. Thomas Barrett is no longer just a struggling shearer trying to survive. He's a successful business owner, a community leader, and the guardian of a legacy that connects past, present, and future. And every time he walks into the shed and smells the wool, hears the buzz of the shears, and feels the familiar ache in his back, he remembers why it was all worth it. Because some things are worth preserving, some dreams are worth chasing, and some miracles happen one small step at a time. If you've made it to the end of Thomas's incredible journey, I want to thank you for being part of this community. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever restored something old or taken on a project that seemed impossible? What did you learn from Thomas's story? Share your thoughts and experiences, because your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and remember that sometimes the greatest achievements come from simply refusing to give up on what matters.